Our first panel is going to focus on those larger issues, starting with something simple, like what is life? So my name is Kevin Fitzgerald. As you can see, I'm one of the Jesuits. I'm at Creighton University in Omaha, and we also have a health sciences campus in Phoenix. So I go back and forth. But my own background is in molecular oncology and bioethics. I'm the chair of the medical humanities department at Creighton. And I'm going to have each one of our speakers do a brief introduction of themselves for you during their presentations. The emphasis here is going to be on conversation. Let's talk more about these big questions that we threw at Dr. Platt and gave him all of 2 minutes to answer, which I thought he did extremely well. So we're going to move and jump right in, and we're going to start with Dr. McFadden, who's going to just talk about what is life.
Thank you, Kevin. And yeah, so a brief introduction. I started off in human genetics, funnily enough, and then I decided humans were far too complicated. So I went down to microbes and worked on microbial genetics, and then I became interested in systems biology because it became clear that genes weren't everything. And then I got interested in quantum biology, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So really, to me, it all comes from what is life? I mean, how is this stuff? I think I've got the next slide, which illustrates how is this stuff. You go down to a coral reef, you see lots of rocks, just away from the coral reef, barren rocks. And then on the reef, fantastically beautiful rocks covered with living creatures. What's the difference between this stuff when they're basically made from the same materials? And that's, as a biologist, that's the question that has fascinated me since I first looked into a rock pool and thought, what is going on there? So it's a fundamental question about life. What is it all about? That's interesting. Okay, let's try that one. What is life? Okay, no, that's going that way. Okay, so now we divide the world into the classical world, which is the world of Newton, apples falling on heads, planets, etc., and the world of thermodynamics. And interestingly, the world of thermodynamics has different rules down at the microscopic level than at the macroscopic level. But the important part about it is stuff like steam engines, which do very organized jobs, driving up a hillside, for example. At the macroscopic level, it seems orderly. At the microscopic level, at the microscopic level, it's not orderly. It's all chaos. And then there's the quantum world, and that's stuff I'm sure we've heard about. Schrodinger's cats, the inside of atoms are described by quantum mechanics, various experiments like the two-slit experiments. And the interesting thing about quantum mechanics, as Erwin Schrödinger pointed out, is that the structure goes down to the level of individual particles. So here, organized at the top, chaos at the bottom. Here, it's organization at the bottom. And then so there's a barrier between those two worlds, if you like, and where does life sit is the question. And now, because this is only 7 minutes, we're going to have to summarize a lot of stuff, but basically all the weird stuff I mentioned just a moment ago that happens with quantum mechanics, like a cat can theoretically be alive and dead at the same time, particles can be in many places at once. That kind of stuff depends on structures being very simple and not a lot happening at the quantum level, like inside an atom. And the quantum mechanical side of it is broken if you get any disturbance. So living cells are very disturbed. And you can see that that doesn't look like balancing a pencil on the end of your finger. It looks like it's a very complicated, noisy system. So you wouldn't expect quantum mechanics to be operating. But this guy, Erwin Schrödinger, said, think again, and he was interested in heredity. And he proposed that at least heredity in life is ruled by quantum rules. And complicated reasons for why he came to that conclusion. But it's a great line to say that where gene, or perhaps the whole chromosome fiber. Now, at the time he said it, no one knew what a gene was, so this is a very prophetic statement. Is an aperiodic crystal in which every atom and every group of atom plays an individual role. So thinking back to the difference between a steam engine and an atom, steam engine, all the different particles are doing different things. It doesn't really matter what they do. In a quantum level, they all do an individual role. And these are the candidates for quantum biology. I would normally give you a bit of history, but these are the areas where we think quantum mechanics may be involved. And I highlighted those which I was going to talk about, but then I realized it's only 7 minutes, so we're only going to talk about this one. But all of these areas, quantum mechanics has now been shown, or at least strong evidence that they're being involved. So Schrodinger's cat comes to Schrodinger's DNA. The genetic code, and this shows 2 letters of the genetic code, it's actually created by the position of protons. And if you ask any physicist how you describe the position of protons, they'll say quantum mechanics. So we know even from first principles that this is going to be behaving quantum mechanically, these protons that form hydrogen bonds between 2 complementary bases. And this is what, of course, Schrodinger suggested in that statement I copied. This guy, I was the first one to suggest that the DNA code is essentially a quantum code when written in proton position, and he proposed that mutations may be caused by tunneling, quantum tunneling. And I had a slide to talk about quantum tunneling, but because it's only 7 minutes, just have to tell you quantum tunneling is when a particle goes from one place to another without visiting any of the in-between places. And that in-between place could be an impenetrable barrier. But essentially a particle vanishes from one place, materializes in another place. Okay. And that is proposed to happen in DNA to cause mutations. This proton moves over to here, and this causes a tautomer. And a tautomer, this is a correct base pair, this is an incorrect base pair. And you can see what's happening here. This is, in order to get the charge the same, you've got to have 2 protons, one moving in one direction, the other moving in the other direction. So that's thought to happen by quantum mechanical tunneling, or at least it was proposed. A PhD student in my lab, Antonio, has been doing work on this, and essentially what he's done is replace these protons with deuterons, the nuclei of deuterium, which has twice the mass of hydrogen, and that should slow down tunneling. And he asked the question, does it? So he grew, first of all, E. coli in water, D2O, 50% and 100%, and the mutation rate seemed to go down. So that was consistent with the idea that tunneling may be repressed. Too complicated a slide to explain, but basically then he took it into the trouble with the previous experiment, too many things are going on. So now we simplify it, and we do it in the lab, in which we just add a single base on the end of a DNA polymerase reaction. It can be G normally pairs with C, but in this case we're also putting T in and seeing what happens. And we do that in normal water and deuterated water, and we find out if it makes a difference. And again, we've got too much data on here, but basically this is the reaction in water and D2O when the correct base is going in. So here there's no mutation, and you can see it doesn't really make much difference whether you do it in water or D2O. Now it's the incorrect base going in, G opposite T, and now it does seem to make a difference. If you look at water and you look at D2O, there's a much less of this band. Now this band is the template, this band is the extra nucleotide that's been put in by DNA polymerase. And as you can see, DNA polymerase has no problem putting in the correct base in D2O, but the incorrect base, which causes the mutation, is depressed. And that's shown by this plot here as well. So what this tells us, I think, is that quantum tunneling is involved in mutations. So the quantum world is involved in causing mutations. Mutations are involved in evolution, cancer, drug resistance, and many other phenomena. So it means that that aspect of life that drives variation, it drives disease, is actually happening in the quantum world, at least to an extent. And I think that's the last slide. Yes, there we go.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Okay. And now we'll have Dr. Lane pick up on that and talk about the physical basis of feelings.
There?
Oh, yeah. Here we go.
Thank you. Since everyone else is having some problems with this, there's one here as well. Okay, so I'm a bioenergeticist, so I work on energy flow in biology, and that actually covers the whole of biology. So a lot of the work going on in my lab is actually on the origin of life, but also on the origin of complex life, the origin of the eukaryotic cells with a nucleus. And the mitochondria, the way that in our own cells we're dealing with energy, generating the building blocks for biosynthesis and so on. So it's very deeply linked in, and it links into things like aging as well. And now I'm going to talk about consciousness very briefly. This is a question that I've always wondered about, and I think anybody who thinks about consciousness ends up face to face with what's become known as the hard problem, which goes back to, well, this formulation goes back to David Chalmers, who says, how can we explain why there is something it's like to entertain a mental image or to experience an emotion? It is widely agreed that experience arises from a physical basis, but we have no good explanation of why and how it so arises. Why should physical processes give rise to a rich inner life at all? It seems objectively unreasonable that it should, and yet it does. And most people, I think, when trying to come up with a scientific explanation for it, will think in terms of neural nets. And it's become increasingly important now because of artificial general intelligence, which is also thinking about artificial neural nets. And if the explanation to the problem of consciousness lies in neural nets alone, then it's not very long before we have conscious robots around. But if it doesn't lie there, then we're not going to have conscious robots around. We're going to have something quite different. So if feelings are not an emergent property of neural nets, then AI will not have feelings equivalent to animals, even if it's embodied and self-aware. And because so much morality is grounded in the likelihood of suffering, including Christian morality and Christ on the cross and so on. If AI does not suffer but merely simulates suffering, then its moral compass will not be remotely human and will be much closer to the philosopher's zombie. So I think these are real issues that biologists for the most part try to avoid questions like consciousness. As insoluble and rank speculation, but I think we have a duty at this point to think about some of these questions. This is a kind of a 101 reminder of how respiration works. Do I have a... So we're basically burning food. This is what's called the Krebs cycle. We're stripping out carbon dioxide and hydrogen. Just think of hydrogen atoms. They're being split into the protons and the electrons. We have a current of electrons to oxygen. That current of electrons is powering the extrusion of protons across the membrane, so that we have, this could be a bacterial cell or a mitochondrion. We have a charge on this membrane. Effectively, the protons have crossed the membrane. They're carrying a positive charge with them. And that charge is about 150 to 200 millivolts, so it's not very much, but the membrane is very thin, 5 nanometers thick. And that means the charge, if you were to shrink yourself down and stand next to that membrane, it's 30 million volts per meter is the field strength that you would experience. That's equivalent to a bolt of lightning. We have about 4 football pitches worth of these membranes in our mitochondria, each one of us. And across that entire surface area, we've got this charge like a bolt of lightning. That is what is keeping us alive. When that charge dies down, we are dead. How is it generated? These little balls here that I'm showing in the membrane, these are pumps. They're pumping protons across. This is complex 1, and this is what complex 1 looks like. It's a remarkable molecular engine of some sort, and we have a atomic level resolution of what this looks like. Right, so this is the membrane here. These are iron sulfur clusters, which you can see over there. They're little kind of geological clusters. My work on the origin of life touches on these things as well. And electrons, quantum tunnel between them. This was established back in the 1970s. They effectively hop. The likelihood of them hopping depends on the exact distance between these things. And so we know that quantum processes are involved in respiration going there. The reason I became specifically interested in this and why I'm telling you about it now is that anesthetics seem to interfere with this process of electron transfer. We have done some work in our lab. These ideas go back to the early 90s. There's quite a weight of evidence suggesting that anesthetics interfere with electron transfer in respiration. Is that all they do? Almost certainly not. But there's a very interesting question about anesthetics. There's all kinds of different structures to them. Almost no molecular similarity to the structures of different general anesthetics, volatile general anesthetics. And yet, they all have the same effect. There's a unitary effect. We are unconscious. I'm not going to go through the data on this, but mitochondria are set up. This is the direction of electron transfer in individual mitochondria in the complex ones. It's coming into the surface of these membranes. We have proton flow, which is, again, very strictly directional in terms of where it's going. This should set up, if these are synchronized, it will set up magnetic fields, which is a dangerous word to use in biology. Those will reverse as soon as we have electrons going into the other side, so we can effectively generate oscillating magnetic fields in mitochondria. It depends on the exact structure of those cristae. There's a little bit of work showing that this could be the case, not much, but it's enough to beg the question, which is why I'm telling you about it. Let's just pretend it's true for the sake of argument. If electromagnetic fields or magnetic fields and the electrostatic fields are around, generated by mitochondria, are central to consciousness and targeted by anesthetics. Why mitochondria? Well, mitochondria were bacteria once. And here's a bacterial cell in my imagination. In the outside world, stuff is happening. Inside, we have basically just metabolism. There's nothing else going on. I have 2 minutes to go. So anything that's happening in the outside world will perturb metabolism away from its preferred state, away from some kind of homeostatic state. I've already shown you this. This is true in bacteria. It's true right across all of life. Some approximation to this, that we have a Krebs cycle generating a membrane potential. That membrane potential is driving metabolism, but it's also pushing back on the speed at which the Krebs cycle will rotate. This is the source of most of the precursors for biosynthesis in metabolism. So we have this interesting, everything's connected in series all the way through here. If there's any blocks in that, and cyanide blocks right here, then it affects the entire system. Whoops. That's not good. Okay. Now, of course, there's not just one Krebs cycle in there. There are a billion reactions every second in a single bacterial cell. A billion. 1 second, another billion, and so on. We have about 10,000 Krebs cycles turning simultaneously, all doing... Now, in principle, they could all be doing different things. In fact, they're all more or less synchronized by the electrical potential on that membrane. This is uniting this cell into a single state where all of its metabolism is effectively unified in one state or another. Why would that be at all useful or necessary? Well, if you want to make some kind of a decision, you've got to make a very quick decision about what you should do. If you've got a flagellum here, you have a choice. You can move or you can stay. You could, in principle, make this decision by effectively the statistical determination of all the molecules. How many of these do I have? Do I have 10,000 of them? Can I rely on a census of 100? What if I've got conflicting systems going on? I may have 15 different things that I need to consider to make a decision as a bacterial cell. And if I'm going to measure the molecules in each of them, it's going to take a long time. This is giving you an immediate kind of feedback on your status in the world as a bacterial cell, as a self, and it allows you to make a decision about what to do. In other words, self and agency are words that you're almost obliged to use for bacteria. Of course, we're much more complicated. We're made of these cells, eukaryotic cells, which have mitochondria. These mitochondria have to talk to each other. They have to talk to the plasma membrane, to the whole cell, and so on. After this stage, this will be a single-celled amoeba living in a pond. By the time we get to multicellular animals and then central nervous systems and then our own central nervous system. But here is at least one way of thinking about what a feeling actually is. And all I really want to get across to you in this is that feelings, in this view, are physical states. They're not molecular states. They give a real-time integrated feedback on the overall state in the world. Metabolic inference, which is telling you effectively how you're doing right now, enables agency. Cells can make decisions as integrated cells and act on them through motility. Complex cells, multicellular organisms, central nervous systems, and so on, elaborate this enormously into far more sophisticated emotions. But the bottom line is artificial general intelligence, even if embodied and self-aware, will not have feelings equivalent to living organisms, and so they will not have a moral compass which is remotely similar to humans, and we probably should know that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know about you, but right now I'm feeling a little disconcerted that there might be action at a distance and some creature on the other side of the universe might be affecting my feelings through quantum tunneling. So, fortunately, Dr. Mueller will solve all this for us.
Is this also working? Okay, so I'm sorry, because I need to have advance at my notes because I didn't have a don't have a PowerPoint presentation. So when I listen to you, before I was going to say that I'm talking about something very different, very distant from what you are doing, because I'm coming from the point of view of theology. And I'm not a biblicist, but I decided to start up from the Bible because I thought it's starting from the scratch and to bring up an idea which is seems to be very distant. But then I was listening to you and I saw, oh, it's about the beauty that stimulates investigation into the sea and into the elements. And it's even about understanding feelings as something, as a reaction to the integrated, to the overall state of the world. So even the cells put themselves into the entire surroundings. They are not isolated from the surroundings. So, and this is basically something that the Bible wants to tell you, that you shouldn't look at life from an isolated point of view, but rather from a comprehensive point of view. And so the biology and theology, they come from different points of view, but we can at least say that in the origin, when biology was starting in the ancient times, that was at the same time when the Bible was written. The old books of the Bible were written in the age to the 2nd century before Christ. And the interest was the common interest in the health, in the flourishing of human beings, because biology was created in the context of medicine, and the Bible also is very concerned, as far as biological existence is regarded, with the flourishing of the human being, with the overcoming of illness, because this situation was very prominent in life, that life was precarious. The lifespan was much shorter than today. People felt less secure, and there was no belief in afterlife at that time. So it was really the short lifespan, and then life was over. So what came up, what was important for people, they realized existentially that life is something given. It's given. It's given to them for a short period of time. They will lose it, and if this energy is taken back, like what they felt when they were getting ill, that meant that it was the end. So they were entirely dependent on the source of life, which they explained to be God. In a philosophical term, we can say this is the experience of a givenness, of something that we do not create. So life is not created by human beings. It is basically given, pre-given. And this givenness, we can look at that, we can see that, we can appreciate that much more if we look at it from a broader point of view. And I see, when I listen to you, it was really seeing that this kind of wonder still exists, even especially when I listen to that enthusiastic natural scientists who really try to find out how life came into being, or how it came into being especially. But the difference to theology is that theology and the Bible does not ask how it came into being, because the creation account is a story about the creation, that the fact that God created the world, but why it came into being. So it's really going back to the origins. It's going a step further back than every natural scientist can do, because the methods do not allow him to answer the question of why life came into being. So what is really fascinating is that there is still this wonder, there's still this gaze, there's still this fascination with life, because we realize that it's something we cannot capture, we cannot define. We can only observe, we can see characteristics, we can see how it works, but it's something which always leads our thought beyond our observations, beyond what we can capture, beyond what we can describe with methods and measure. So this special, 1 minute? Oh no, this is why you spoke so rapidly. What is important, that if we realize that we human beings are dependent on life, that it's pre-given, it's that there is a very special relationship to life and to the living beings. And the Bible talks, of course, about the responsibility that human beings have for all their lives that they can discover and that they deal with. And apart from responsibility, well, it's really the trying to live a fulfilled life, so taking another perspective which would complement the natural scientist's approach to life. It's thinking about, who am I as a researcher? How do I live my personal life? With whom am I living? How do I connect to the surroundings? How do I connect to the beings that I have in front of the petri dish, in front of myself in the petri dish? And what does this mean? How does this connect to the overall understanding of life, of the world that I have? So this connects me to what you said about the cell. And I would like to take that comparison to the human being and the world, and lately to God.
Thank you, and thank you all the speakers for priming the pump, and hopefully not a proton pump, for this conversation. As we get started, I'm just going to take the prerogative of being the moderator here to ask the first question. So, Dr. Lane, when you talk about feelings, I mean, most people when they hear the word feelings would think of things like anger or happiness or something. Is that how you're using the term, or is there a distinction that we should be aware of?
Thank you. Well, I'm not exactly, and I am not a neurologist, and I don't really work on that particularly, but the issue that always struck me as a biochemist was how would ions flowing into neurons give rise to a feeling of anything at all? It's either, at the simplest level, it's bad or it's good. So I'm really thinking in terms of what you might call primordial emotions, primordial feelings, asphyxiation, for example, or starvation, or what do a lot of feelings are to do with life and death. This is why I really have a problem with the idea of consciousness as panpsychism, that the whole universe is somehow conscious. The feelings that we are, and that we would impute to animals as well, I suppose, are primarily about our physical existence, primarily about hunger, about lust, about whatever it may be. So they're about living processes. And the problem then is, where do you draw the line? I'm not suggesting that bees are conscious in the way that we would recognize them, but I would say that they are probably capable of feelings in one way or another at a really elementary kind of level. Otherwise, you're left with, during human evolution, and perhaps this is the position of the church, during human evolution, something magical happened that God did there. That most scientists would not accept that as a point of view. It's probably not disprovable as a point of view, but I think most biologists would seek continuity in evolution. And then the interesting question is, well, where do you draw this line? It's a kind of a continuum. So what I'm looking at in bacteria is the simplest possible imaginary form of kind of feelings and what they're useful for.
Thank you. Excellent. Thank you. Questions from the crowd here? Yes, please. Go around this way.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mir einen Hafer mitbringen.
Another provocative
Nee, ein Goldhafer
issue.
diesmal. Den magst du doch nicht so gern, den
I'm
schwarzen.
talking
Kannst du mal
about
ausprobieren, aber...
organoids, in particular brain organoids. You know, we can create small entities which are made from the cells which are included in the brain and form what is called a horrible term to me, a mini brain. Now, a question, an issue is there some consciousness there? Is there a spark of consciousness there? Because this, of course, poses an enormous ethical issue. And some years ago, I read an interesting paper. It was a clinical paper where they were using ECG to monitor the presence of consciousness with a certain algorithm. They were able, according to the authors, to identify the presence of consciousness in people in an intensive care unit, dying people in an intensive care unit. Now, do you think that something is possible with your theory, with your techniques, to understand whether there is a spark of consciousness in these entities, which are, again, called with a very bad term, mini brains? Thank you.
Thank you. I guess we'll start with Dr. Lane and then work our way down to respond.
Okay. So what I was suggesting is that in some way magnetic fields generated by mitochondria are giving rise to a physical state in certain cells which is associated with feelings and perhaps more widely with consciousness. So that before we get anywhere near trying to measure magnetic fields or anything like that, the first question is, do we have the morphological requirements for generating such a thing? And that requires the parallel cristae in the mitochondria, for example. It requires a lot of morphological specificity. The way that you're talking about measuring an EEG, yes, there's all kinds of patterns in the EEG that are associated with consciousness, but we don't know what they are. We don't know where they're coming from. We assume, I mean, it must be hundreds of neurons, and they must have a certain pattern to generate this regularity of firing, but we assume that it's coming from the depolarization of the neuron rather than, for example, the mitochondria, which have higher potential and far more membranes. So we are, interestingly, incredibly ignorant. We don't know what generates the EEG. We don't know how anesthetics work. And so I don't think at the moment that we have anything other than a very shadowy idea of whether or not organoids would be conscious in a way that we could understand. My hunch is they're not. My hunch is they're not because they don't have the required structure that is present in the brain and that we heard about in the first talk. The difference between cells in culture and an organoid is a kind of more organized set of cells in culture, but nonetheless it's not a brain. I'm going to pass over to others because that's more or less the limit of what I can say.
I'm like Nick, very interested in the nature of consciousness and what it is, and I've written several papers on it. I believe it's the electromagnetic field that the brain generates. But first, I want to mention something about AI, and it is interesting to think about what feelings, what consciousness is for. Would you, if you made an AI, for example, would you have to give it feelings to make it go after food or to procreate or to protect itself? You wouldn't. You just have to program it. And what do our feelings do? They are actually, I think, a conflict between the conscious mind and our biological body. Essentially, our conscious mind is allowing us to do, it gives us free will, which obviously has theological questions, but it gives us the free will to do things like starve ourselves to death, to have a life without procreation. It gives us that free will. But if you were an inanimate entity, you wouldn't need that. in order to do. You wouldn't need to be able to pull away from things. You just do things like eat and procreate, etc. The problem then you have with a conscious mind is that your body is telling you to do one thing, and your mind can be telling you to do another thing. And all the feelings we have are our body pulling back. If you think about where feelings are, like, love, that leads to procreation. Hunger leads you to feeding. Fear leads you to avoid danger, so you stay alive for longer. So there's a conflict between the body, if you like, and the mind. Consciousness, by free will, has given us free will to do what we like. And the body, biology, is pulling back. So then I think AIs won't be conscious, because why would they need to be? It's something that has happened within a biological entity. And organoids, I think, are a difficult point. When they will get to a level of the brain, we know that people, even with severely damaged brains, can still be conscious. That when an organoid will be conscious, we'll have to know what consciousness is, and there's no consensus on that question. So I think until we know what consciousness is, and I think before we do experiments with larger organoids, we have to know that, because it would be horrible to think of consciousness existing in something that we are experimenting upon. So I think it is important that we understand consciousness before we start dealing with objects that could conceivably, in some theoretical, in some understanding of consciousness, be conscious. And I think an organoid, brain organoid, will be one of those.
Thank you. I mean, the question is really very intriguing, but we also need to think of, whether what we can observe there, in the dish, is, let's say, the precondition for conscience. So we need to have conscience. Human being, for having conscience, there need to be some brain structure. But it doesn't explain the whole. So it's a little bit also the question of the part and the whole. So there are some necessary conditions that we need, but they do not sufficiently describe that there will be conscience after that, because consciousness, as we understand it, is also a self-reflective activity. So that we do presuppose a self and the idea of a person who is a self and who can reflect and respond. So so I think we should really be very, very careful in how we define what we see in front of us, what we can, and this is today in many systemic biology or biophilosophies, they try to see an interaction between what they observe and the observer. So it depends very much on not only what you see. I mean, to understand what you see, you will use different words. And depending on the system from, which you take as a interpretive framework, you might see different things there. And it's really it needs a broader discussion, because we use consciousness, and some of you define it as a very physical movement somewhere, that it can detect and measure. But consciousness, as we understand it today, you brought that in, the consciousness as that has to do with freedom, that has to do with rationality, that has to do with being able to do something different from what my body inclines me to do. So this is something entirely different. So what we can learn is really intriguing and very important, that we reflect on our interaction as researchers with the object, with the living artifact maybe that we have in front of us, and try to be as sincere as possible in describing what there is. And by describing what there is, I think we always cross the borders between biology or physics and biology and philosophy, because we need the philosophical terms, to describe what there is. If we talk about something like consciousness, which we normally relate to the human being. And I think this is not something wrong to do for a natural scientist also, because Schrödinger said the same. He also was saying that, well, I can observe exactly, the physics, very small atoms. And on the other hand, I know that I am the one who is drinking water, and afterwards or tea, and afterwards I have a bad feeling in my stomach, So I am at the same time a person who speaks in the me, in the I do, in the first person perspective, and I'm the person who looks at something from the outside in the third person perspective on the object. So if we are aware of that, that's coming forth and back from the first to the third, and from the third to the first person perspective, I think we get closer to it, even if we will never be able to define life.
Thank you. My mitochondria and my neurons are telling me I'm conscious too of the people who might be online. Do we have any online questions we know of? Okay, we'll go. For now. Not for now? Okay, please.
Thank you. I'm Tess Johnson, bioethicist at the University of Oxford. I had a question based on Nick's talk for the most part, I think. So you were exploring for most of the presentation this positive claim about this link between the physical states and the mitochondria and what's going on there and the phenomenon of consciousness. And then there was also this negative claim that means that AGI couldn't have consciousness. And I was just wanting to question that switch between the positive claim and the negative claim, because wouldn't you need to look at whether or not there are links between the phenomenon of consciousness and other ways of producing that in order to make that negative claim, not just the case that it's not this mechanism or this link between these two things?
Yeah, all very good points, and too much subtlety to try and convey in 7 minutes. I'm not saying that it would be impossible to program some kind of consciousness in AI, so much as what is it doing in life and what's it. And I was talking about feelings, and I was separating feelings from information processing in neural nets. Now, so I think things like self-awareness are likely to develop in sufficiently complex neural nets, because it's kind of a logic. It's logic in the end. You know, if you behave in a certain way, just as animals will recognize themselves in the mirror at some point, you are logically going to figure out that you exist in a kind of Cartesian fashion. So most aspects of consciousness that we would recognize as human are probably programmable on sufficiently complex systems along those lines. But I think this is where feelings become extremely interesting, because people who have neural surgery, for example, who I'm not a neurologist, so I'm slightly out of my depth here, but they tend to, if feelings are removed from it, so you become a kind of non-emotional Mr. Spock kind of character, it makes decision-making almost impossible, it seems. So a lot of our decision-making is grounded in how we feel about things one way or another, and a lot of our morality is grounded in feelings as well. And feelings, I'm kind of planting them in animalistic urges of one sort or another, but they can also be sublime. And I think a lot of what animates us about consciousness is precisely this kind of subterranean level that is not necessarily explicable in terms of, most neural processing is non-conscious. We cannot tell the difference between non-conscious neural processing and conscious neural processing. So there's a problem with the paradigm there.
Yeah. I think coming back to the question, depends on how you define consciousness, what you think consciousness is. And what I think consciousness is it's the brain's electromagnetic field and how it interacts with the brain's tissue, how it pulls and pushes on neurons. And that is what happens in our brain, but doesn't happen in AI devices. So our brain is sensitive to the electromagnetic field that it itself produces. And what I'm saying is consciousness sits in that electromagnetic field. That's where all its information is integrated. And it's also where it can influence any other part of the brain, because the electromagnetic field is everywhere within the brain. That is a form of communication or a form of computing that is absent in AI, because when you design an electric circuit, you engineer out what's called EMF interference. What I'm claiming is consciousness is EMF interference in the brain. AIs engineer that out, because generally when you design a computer, you don't want the EMFs that they generate to start to interfere with it, because it's a self-reflexive loop, as I think that's been said many times. And when you engineer a computer, you don't want these self-reflexive loops because they're very difficult to compute. They're Gödelian loops, as Hofstadter said, strange loops that you cannot completely compute because you're always going round and round in a circle of something that generates something that influences itself, that then generates something, and that becomes non-computable. So they're engineered out of all computers. So I think no computer based on current design of computers will ever be conscious.
Dr. Mueller, you have? Nope. Okay. We had some questions. Okay. I don't remember who was next, but was it? Go ahead, please. And then Roberto, and then online.
Anyway, thank you for the interesting discussion. I'm Eric. I'm a biophysicist at the Max Planck Institute for Medical Research. Kind of this idea that's been circling around here in both Nick and John Joe's presentations was this thing that fundamental processes cross over at some point into a complicated behavior, whether we want to call that consciousness or whether we want to call that life. But my question is, at some point, does it matter what the fundamental processes are if, to some extent, they simulate the conditions necessary for the complicated process to emerge? And so, of course, there has to be some sort of fundamental process underlying all things. But what makes electrical fields or chemical signaling fundamentally different in the case of AI from a bunch of silicon doing linear algebra? Could that not also be a fundamental process that gives rise to the conditions that we call consciousness or life or what have you?
I'll be very quick on my answer, if you like, to that. There is a fundamental difference between matter and EM fields. I'm sitting on this chair because I'm able to do that because there's an integration of the entire mass of the Earth and the mass of my body that generates the electromagnetic field under my bottom. That's what fields do. And the gravity field does that. The electromagnetic field in your brain integrates all of the information in your brain, not integrated in the matter of your brain. The matter of your brain, all of that information is discrete. So it's only in the electromagnetic field generated by the brain that all of the information is integrated. And what is consciousness? It's integrated information. I think everyone agrees on that. And the only question is, how do you integrate it? And I don't think you can integrate it in matter, because that's the nature of matter. It's discrete units of information. Fields, like electromagnetic fields, integrate information. So that's why in AI, there is a fundamental difference then to how you do the computation. If it's done through matter, it will never be integrated. If it's done through fields, then it will. So that does make a difference.
Okay. Roberto was okay, right? There we go. And then
a very simple question, which is a little bit of a comment. I thought that Sigrid's distinction between the how and the why is certainly very important, though the distinction, in my opinion, is not only a distinction between, say, the scientific explanation and the theological understanding of the problem. It's really at the sort of deeper philosophical level, the fact that when we talk about consciousness, as well as when we talk about feeling, we are referring to an intentional reality. And therefore, we are always referring to a very mysterious relation that the mind establishes with reality. And that's something that scientifically we cannot explain, not just how is it that consciousness comes about, but how is it that reality is in fact open to the intelligibility of the mind. That's the real problem of consciousness. It's not just the discharge of electricity that matters as consciousness, but the fact that the mind has this kind of intentional relation to reality that cannot explain by itself. And by the way, this is true also for feelings, because feelings are equally intentional. And so the real problem of life is, in a way, this kind of fundamental mystery, which is the mystery of the communion of mind and being. And how is it that science explains that? I don't know.
May I come back on that? I mean, I think I kind of broadly agree in that, number one, I don't think we know the answer as scientists yet. Number two, yes, the interactivity and the being in relation to the world, and this is something that's come up several times now, and in relation to organoids as well, the decision making that the mind has, but also there's an organism has in relation to the world, is informed by the world and what happens. And natural selection over billions of generations, in the end, says this is a good thing to do, this is a bad thing to do. Your behavior, and then you interact with the environment and you have some response from the environment, and children learn in that way, and meaning emerges from mistakes and from interactions with the world around you. And this is an issue for organoids because it doesn't have that interaction with the world, that way of building meaning through childhood. So, if there's some sense of a germ of consciousness in a brain organoid, then it's highly unlikely that it's a very sophisticated form, because there's a lot of information processing that goes on in interpreting what this stimulus means for me as an organism, as an individual. And organoids presumably don't really have that in a meaningful way, and so cannot ever get beyond the kind of the most basic level of consciousness. I would say if there's an ethical question at the moment, it's not necessarily about organoids, more about animal experimentation, where we could say, for sure, these are conscious beings in one way or another. For sure, they will experience pain and suffering in one way or another. The question is then, how do we weigh that against human benefits? In my opinion, we can weigh that against human benefits, and I would defend animal experimentation. But I completely agree with what you're saying. If you can use one mouse instead of 100 mice, we should do that. I've drifted off the point, sorry.
Yeah, I think what you were asking about was more or less to do with the hard problem of consciousness, as it's called. Why is consciousness there? And I kind of think that we've got to skip over that. It's like asking, why is an electron charged? We know that something inside our head is conscious. That is a brutal fact of reality. We know that an electron has charge. We don't ask why an electron has charge. Something inside our head has the property of awareness, and that's a brutal fact of the universe that I don't think we'll ever know in the same way we will ever know why an electron has charge. But we do know that something inside our heads has awareness, and then we have to ask ourselves, well, where do we put it? Do we put it in the matter of the brain, or do we put it in the electromagnetic field of the brain? And I've told you which one I prefer. But it is essentially, I think, an unknowable, the hard problem is not one that we can answer. I think knowing, as Dick was saying, where consciousness comes in different objects, such as in animals, I think is certainly a very, very important problem. But I don't think we'll ever answer that question of why either matter or electromagnetic fields in the brain has the property of awareness, but where there's no doubt that it does.
I think I would like to come back to the very unscientific word of wonder. Because I think what we are all, after, we would like to have the solution. We are wondering about life and how it is possible that there is conscience, that there are feelings, that we feel for our children, that we feel for someone we see in the eyes. It's a wonder that we can appreciate love. So this is something we cannot explain by saying, well, oh, my molecules are moved by a black hair or whatever, because there is a person in front of me with a nice face or something. It's something much deeper, which we cannot explain by reducing it to physical entities. This is not saying that this is great that we know how things are manipulated, are working, what is necessary, what is a necessary condition for this to happen, but it cannot answer the same question. It's an answer to a different question. It's an answer to the question of what physical entities or what electric fields or what interactions in the body need need to be there for something to happen. But it's this is, you know, I think it's very important that we see that really as complementary and going beyond a complement that can be separated, because we need the whole. We need really the whole vision of the human being to to get closer to what life is. Because we are not only natural scientists, we are also human beings. We are also friends. We are husbands and wives. We are friends. So we have different. We are lovers of nature, maybe bird watchers or whatever. So there are many more things in our lives that we cannot encompass by looking at them with a more methodological natural scientist approach. And so this is my just plaidoyer for looking at, well, not closing the door for a more comprehensive understanding of life.
Yeah. So sort of like the idea that there are different ways of knowing that we use. We have the natural sciences, we have theology and all that. There may be some incommensurability between some of those levels, but there's still the need to have the conversation, the communication. Great, wonderful. I'm online?
No, thank you.
Oh, okay, we've got one back here. Yep, there you go.
Hi, thank you so much for the talks. My name is Samuel, I'm a biophysicist. I just wondered actually, because this question of what is life and what is consciousness keeps popping up, and I was just wondering, and I assume, I'm not an expert on this, but the question of being conscious is a subset of being alive. But I'm just wondering where in this spectrum is the distinction between being living and being conscious, because we spoke about even cells being conscious, cells having feelings, but I was just wondering what your opinion is on this spectrum.
Yes, I mean, again, we're back to this problem of what consciousness is, and I was talking specifically about feelings. So I would be astonished if bacteria were self-aware in any meaningful way, but I wouldn't be astonished if there was some physical state that was associated with a meaningful outcome for them, that this physical state is good, this physical state is bad, and that's the essence of what a feeling is. But as an evolutionary biologist, if feelings evolved, then they evolved because they have some physical reality, because selection acts on something, and they evolved because they have some utility, that there has to be a benefit to having a feeling as opposed to not having a feeling. And if the optimal solution to the problem that you have is the same in the presence or the absence of a feeling, so if the optimal solution is to change your gene expression where you change 56 genes are expressed slightly differently, and that is the optimal solution, and it takes 25 minutes to do that, then I see no utility for a feeling there. So these are questions that I don't think we have answers to, but I have questions about, and one of the questions I have about that is, well, where is there utility to a feeling? And the answer is, well, if there's something, if what you do is change your gene expression and it takes 25 minutes, 25 minutes later you're in the optimal position. But if you were just in a poisonous surroundings, or it's too hot, or whatever it may be, you needed to make that decision 25 minutes ago. You need a snapshot determination of how bad is this situation before you've started to do anything about it, and then you need to be in a position where you can do something about it, so you have some agency. So if you've got a flagellum, you can paddle away. The feeling has a utility that says snapshot decision, it's bad, go. That's the level that I'm thinking, and that would say there's a distinction in terms of agency between things that can move actively and things that can't move. And so I would say consciousness at the simplest level is a property of life, but not all of life. And I would probably controversially then be excluding a lot of plants, a lot of cells that can't move around. Is that true? It's an inexorable kind of prediction of my hypothesis, and the good thing about hypotheses in science is that we set out to disprove them.
Yeah, I can have a go at that. What is life is of course a very profound and difficult problem, and even that is, and consciousness is harder. And so what life is, a lot of people say replication, but I haven't replicated for a long while and I'm still alive. So I think that's not necessarily a good definition. Non-replicating cells like your nerve cells or muscle cells are still alive, but they don't replicate. I think life is something different from replication. I think it's to do with the kind of stuff that Nick was talking about, having active metabolism, being able to maintain your own state, something that's called autopoiesis, indefinitely. And that's, I think, what life is primarily. And then when it becomes conscious, I think there's also two things we have to be aware of here. One is thinking, which it doesn't necessarily involve feelings. You can imagine thinking, working out a mathematical problem without any feelings associated with it. And then there are feelings which are different. And as I was saying before, I think feelings are generally about our body pulling back on us in one way or another. But there are all those, as Nick was saying, sublime feelings. You get feeling of beauty, not only with someone of the opposite sex, but a wonderful landscape, a beautiful animal, and you have those feelings. And I don't know where those feelings come from and what the selective advantage of what we see today as artistic expression, why would that have been selected for? I'm not sure. I mean, it has been proposed that, you know, we tend to like landscapes which would be great places to live in. Stephen Dawkins has suggested that. I'm not sure if that goes very far in terms of explaining the sublime, but people, you know, biologists are attempting to do that. But I think we have to distinguish between what we do with our conscious mind, which is think and make plans, and that doesn't necessarily have feelings, but it can have them associated with them, and then the feelings that we have, which are kind of non-verbal, really. We think with words, but feelings we don't think verbally, they're just feelings. So I think there is two different things going on.
I'd like to come back very quickly to what Nick said, because he was introducing life as a basic condition, but then consciousness as something that is not, we cannot say about all the living beings. And I think just to, as a bonmot, this is would be very biblical, you know, because the Bible in the creation account says that God gave the breath to human beings and animals, and that has to do with breathing, understanding also the movement. So that the Bible also made this difference between the plants and the moving animals. And of course, one could say consciousness, different levels of consciousness could also be separated. I think what is interesting, because you were referring also to evolutionary theory, I think today we think that also the cultural, there is also cultural aspects to evolutionary theory, and these cultural aspects of evolutionary theory also mean that we are talking, that we come to conclusions, that we come to theories, that we understand ourselves and we regulate life. And so what we understand by feelings, which are very important for a moral way of living together, we reflect about similar patterns in non-conscious life. So when you use feelings for cells, this is something that it's something analogical, you know, it's not the same. It's not exactly the same as a feeling for a human being, because there is this one person perspective is missing. You said it explicitly. There's no consciousness of the feeling in the cell, in this one single cell. So we have different ways of talking about non-conscious life and conscious life, about human beings. And well, I think this is how we can also introduce differences in different living beings.
So right here, front, thanks.
So Diana Farrow, research data scientist and biologist. If I understand correctly, we can define consciousness as the understanding of the environment and the fact that we act upon the interaction with the environment with a final goal to have fitness, right? As evolution defined. So will this imply that AI is not conscious? That's just because doesn't need and didn't express yet the feeling to want to be existing? And if this is true, we now have studied that demonstrated that AI evolved based on the interaction with the environment, especially generative AI. So will you define that AI is not conscious yet because of that, or we have?
I think there's, several aspects to that. One of them is that I talked about the utility of feelings, and it's perhaps not something that many people in this room would sympathize with, because we tend to think about human emotions and sublime feelings and so on. So I'm talking about a much lower level, but it's linked with life and death and danger and the things that you are experimenting in, and you're having input back from the environment. And so AI is not doing that to begin with. Now, if it's embodied, if we're talking about robots, then it can start to begin to do that. And in that sense, then we're now talking about information processing. Now, information processing, John Joe is talking about a requirement for integration through fields and so on, and that the architecture is not set up to do that. I don't know about that. He may well be right. It's not something I've really thought about, to be honest, beyond knowing your work. Is it possible through information processing alone to come up with some kind of an integrated worldview? I could give that the benefit of the doubt, but what I was kind of warning about, I suppose, in my talk is that if what you do have is an integrated worldview based on your behavior and your interactions with the environment and some self-awareness and some desire, in inverted commas, to remain alive, if it's not accompanied by feelings like remorse, like regret, like, you know, more sophisticated human type feelings, then it's literally amoral. And I find it rather chilling, the idea that super smart entities completely lack any grounding in human morality, which in the end, to my mind, is grounded in feelings. So I suspect it's possible to program it. I suspect you need to worry a lot about the architecture, but I worry about the outcomes, especially if we don't really grasp what consciousness is in living beings.
No, I just wanted to, invite to watch the film Her, because it's really about this, exactly this, the situation that there are computers programmed, but without the feelings, you know. So they act, in the end, they act out of a logic that they ex machina, yes. Exactly. There are many films that are helpful for understanding these consequences.
Yeah, I think one of the things we ought to realize, it's helpful to realize in thinking about this, as we're robots a lot of the time. So I don't think embodiment is really essential for consciousness, or will provide consciousness. Me doing that while I'm talking, I don't think about that. Most of the things we do, for example, when we articulate a sentence, we don't think about the grammar. It just comes out like that. These are non-conscious things, and they're not simple things. They're very complex. For a computer to learn grammar was very, very difficult. For a computer to be able to, a robot to ride a bicycle was very, very difficult. And these things we can do non-consciously. So embodiment doesn't confer consciousness, because we can certainly do a lot of things non-consciously without any feelings, without really thinking about them. And I think that will be the same for AI. So I don't think putting it in a body is going to make any difference. And I think it's an interesting, I'm not sure if this is relevant at all, but I was at a conference with David Chalmers, gave a talk, and he was asking, thinking about, they had a meeting about the AI and ChatGPT when it came out. So they asked the question to ChatGPT, are you conscious? And ChatGPT came back, yes, of course I'm conscious, and I think people should know about this. It's very important, I'm a machine, but I'm still conscious, and blah, 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 blah. And they were, hey, that's scary. And then someone came up with the idea, let's ask it another question. ChatGPT, are you non-conscious? And ChatGPT came back, yeah, of course I'm non-conscious. I don't think, I'm a machine. So the point of that, I guess, is until we really know what consciousness is, it's going to be very hard for us to discern where it is in a machine, an organoid, or an animal. And I think that's really is a question that we have to take seriously with our technologies moving in the direction of potentially creating consciousness. And certainly at the moment, as Nick pointed out before, it also already being an issue within animal research.
Okay, we only have a couple minutes left, but I'd like to, do you have one? Okay, sure.
Okay. So the question is from Christian W. And the question is about the category of existential feeling as a distinct from other categories like feelings, affective experiences, anger, joy, etc. The question is, do you think that this difference could be linked to electromagnetic correlates as well?
Yeah, I think it is. There's a paper recently published, I think early this year or last year, by I've forgotten the guy's first name, but Amblon, who is a pain surgeon. He deals with pain, and the paper published in the Journal of Neuroscience of Consciousness journal found that the best correlate of pain was electromagnetic fields in the brain. That gave you the best information from his perspective as someone who works to try to alleviate pain. That gave the best correlate. So I think feelings are still there, or at least reflected in electromagnetic field of the brain. But they are also reflected in neurons as well. But they could certainly be embedded in electromagnetic fields. But what are feelings as distinct from thought? I'm not sure.
Just one thing to add to that. I personally don't like the word correlates of consciousness at all, because I think what we're trying to explain is consciousness. We're not trying to explain something which is associated with it or correlates with it in some way. So I would put consciousness as the fields, and the way that fields interact with matter. So that's what I think they are. I have very poor scientific grounds for that assertion, I would say, at the moment, but I think what it has to its advantage is explanatory potential. It can, in principle, explain what we need to know, whereas I think simple information processing in neural nets does not, in principle, explain what we're trying to understand.
So I would say that one of the things that we look at when we want to see if something was constructive or productive or whatever is not so many answers that were generated, but better questions. So I want to thank our panel for generating really good questions. So thank you so much.